Okay, let's just dive right into this explainer and inspect the magnificent edifice we call science. We're so used to thinking of science as this ultimate, unshakable bedrock of truth, right? Well, today we're going to use the fascinating field of science and technology studies to peel back the layers of that bedrock. We're going to look at the human, the messy, and the profoundly social scaffolding that actually holds up our entire understanding of the natural world.
Now, this brings up a rather radical tension to our standard high school textbook view of reality. We're usually taught that scientists are perfectly neutral observers, just reading the facts straight from the book of nature. But what if that objectivity is a myth? What if the truths we just blindly accept are shaped just as much by human negotiation as they are by raw data?
Section 1, The Myth of Pure Science, Classical Foundations. So historically, there were two classic ways we thought science logically accumulated unquestionable truths. On one side, we have logical positivism, famously championed by the Vienna Circle back in the 1930s. They argued that science is built simply by taking individual empirical observations and logically verifying them to create sweeping general statements. Simple enough, right? But then, on the other side is Karl Popper's falsificationism. Popper argued that the real hallmark of science wasn't proving things right, but making incredibly risky predictions and trying to prove them wrong. If a theory survives the test, it stays. If it fails, it gets tossed out. Both of these views, however, totally rely on the idea that there's a strict, logical, and mathematical relationship between human theories and physical data. Basically, this popular snapshot portrays science as this perfectly objective method, completely insulated from the messy real world. The idea is that anyone running the exact same experiment should logically arrive at the exact same conclusion, building the steady upward staircase of pure truth. But, well, as philosophers started looking a bit closer, that staircase started to look a little wobbly. Section 2, Cracks in the Foundation, Philosophical Flaws. When we actually start inspecting those cracks, we run into three core philosophical concepts that literally shatter the idea of a guaranteed, logical path from the material world to scientific truth. Let's unpack how they dismantle this whole notion that facts just speak for themselves. First up is the problem of induction, famously raised by David Hume. Here's the thing. Even something as universally accepted as the sun rises every 24 hours falls prey to this problem. Why? Because past data can never absolutely guarantee future patterns. Just because you've seen a pattern a million times doesn't mathematically mean the million and first time won't be totally different. I mean, think about the polar regions. There are days when the sun literally never rises at all. We assume nature is regular, but there's actually no strict logic that proves our past observations will perfectly predict the future. Next, we've got the Duhem-Quine thesis. This one argues that a scientific theory is never actually tested in a vacuum. It relies on a massive web of belief. We're talking assumptions about your tools, your math, your background data, the whole shebang. This perfectly explains why even Isaac Newton fudged his own optical data when it didn't perfectly match his gravitational theories. When Newton's calculations for the moon's path failed to match the telescope data, he didn't just throw out his theory of gravity. No, he assumed the optical theories used to collect the data were wrong, and he tweaked the numbers. He basically protected his core theory by blaming a totally different part of the web. And finally, we have underdetermination, which is just a fancy way of saying there are always an infinite number of theories that could perfectly explain the exact same set of data points. So if we can't rely on pure logic, how do scientists actually choose? Section 3, The Kuhnian Revolution, Normal Science and Crisis.
So, heading into the 1960s, historian Thomas Kuhn looks at the actual history of science and realizes it looked absolutely nothing like the steady, logical accumulation of facts we were promised. Instead, he argued that science actually consists of these well-structured, almost dogmatic periods he called normal science. During these periods, scientists aren't out there questioning the foundations of the universe. Not at all. They're basically just puzzle solving, using established methods to fill in the blanks of a picture they already accept. Kuhn called this shared picture a paradigm. And the crucial point here is that when you're trained in a paradigm, you aren't just looking at raw dots and lines. You learn to see the world through the incredibly powerful lens of your shared scientific culture. It literally shapes what you physically observe. But, nature doesn't always perfectly fit into our neat little boxes.
When unexplainable anomalies start piling up, it triggers a period of profound crisis. And this eventually leads to a radical scientific revolution, a total paradigm shift, where the old scientific world is essentially demolished and entirely replaced. The jump from Newton's physics to Einstein's, that wasn't just a simple software upgrade. It was a completely different way of seeing reality itself. Kuhn even argued that paradigms are sometimes incommensurable, meaning scientists working across different paradigms practically live in different worlds and struggle to even communicate with one another.
Section 4. The Strong Program Sociology of Knowledge.
Okay, let's look at David Bloor's 4 tenets of the strong program, and specifically that really bold symmetry principle. Historically, people used things like society or ideology to explain away bad science or false beliefs, while claiming that the true beliefs were just the result of raw, pure logic. Well, Bloor said absolutely not. If you want to study science objectively, you have to treat true beliefs and false beliefs symmetrically, meaning you have to investigate the messy social causes behind the accepted truths, too. To see this in action, let's look at how mathematicians dealt with geometric shapes that broke Euler's 3D formula. For decades, mathematicians firmly believed that for a specific 3D shape called a polyhedron, the number of vertices minus the edges plus the faces always equaled 2. But then these really weird counterexamples started showing up. Some mathematicians literally called them monsters and tried to banish them to protect their elegant theory, which, by the way, is a wonderfully dramatic reaction to a geometric shape. Others, however, welcomed them. According to Bloor, there was no single logical answer here. It was the mathematician's specific cultural and institutional background that actually decided what counted as a valid geometric shape. To take this even further, historian Stephen Shapin looked at the 1820s scientific debate over reading head bumps, phrenology, and argued it was actually just a reflection of deep class struggles in Edinburgh. The research shows that the upper-class members of the Royal Society violently opposed phrenology, while the lower and middle classes strongly championed it in their own scientific society. The analysis essentially suggests the scientific debate was mirroring the broader political reform movements of the time. So, regardless of whether phrenology was valid or not, the strong program uses this to show that our social interests map directly onto our scientific positions. And we see this in modern tech, too. Take intercontinental ballistic missile tests. When the U.S. tested them, they'd launched from California out to the Marshall Islands. But they stripped the warhead, added sensors, and meticulously prepped the silo. As one general bluntly put it, by the time it actually launched, only the tail number was the same as a real combat missile. So how do you logically know the test proves it'll work in combat? You don't. You actually have to socially interpret the data and collectively decide, yeah, it's close enough. Section 5, Science as a Social Act, Games of Capital. So if we rebuild our edifice of science entirely with this social scaffolding, how does it actually function day to day? Well, French anthropologist Pierre Bourdieu argued that scientists are competing actors playing a deeply social game. Every published paper, every experiment, it's all a strategic move to gain cultural capital and authority in the field. It doesn't mean scientists don't care about the truth, for sure, but it means the pursuit of that truth is inherently tied up in human reputation, power, and authority. But wait, if everyone is just fighting for capital and living in completely different Kuhnian paradigms, how do they actually collaborate? Think of it like international trade. You don't need to speak perfectly fluent Japanese to buy goods in Tokyo. You just need a shared, simplified language, a pidgin, for the transaction. Scientists from completely different fields create these trading zones to pass data and tools back and forth without having to completely adopt each other's complex worldviews. They also pull this off using physical artifacts known as boundary objects. For example, a standardized museum record can brilliantly coordinate work between amateur trappers and professional zoologists. The amateur collector and the geneticist have totally different visions of what that animal specimen actually means, but the standardized tag on the leg, the boundary object, allows them to coordinate their efforts perfectly without ever needing to share the same worldview. So, to wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you to ponder this endlessly fascinating question as you look at the wonderfully human world of knowledge around you. We've seen that the path from the material world to scientific truth isn't just an automated escalator of pure logic. It is paved by human negotiation, social interests, paradigm shifts, and incredibly creative communication. Does this mean science isn't real? Not at all. But it does mean that science is a living, breathing human activity. And understanding that, well, it makes it not less impressive, but profoundly more fascinating. Thanks for learning with me today.